will now talk in detail about the different individual parts that are on a motherboard. Let us first study the various types of expansion slots in detail. The first type of slot that we are going to study are the PCI slots. PCI stands for Peripheral Component Inputs and are very useful slots. There are multiple slots under PCI slots. These slots come in different sizes. The first one we will see is the generic PCI slot. As shown on the screen, there are 4 of these types on the motherboard, and these PCI slots have a small nub on them. As we can see, that nub is there because different PCI slots may have different voltages. It can be 5 volts, 3.3 volts, etc. As we can see on this particular slot, the majority portion of the slot is to the left side and the remaining portion is on the right side. This indicates that it is a 5 volt slot. This nub here prevents us from placing a 3 volt card into the slot. If the situation is reversed and the small section is to the left and large section is to the right, then that would be our 3.3 volt. Now when we talk about left and right, look at the board with the input-output to the left side, and that is how you can tell the difference. The next PCI slot is the PCIX slot. PCIX is actually a 64-bit slot, whereas the PCI is only a standard 32-bit slot. What this means is that we can receive 64 bits of information simultaneously across this connection rather than just 32 bits of information. It's faster and, as you can see, larger, which gives it a greater surface area for that information to get through. Now again, these PCIX are similar like with the PCI, where they have different voltages too. The last version of PCI slots is the PCIe slots. These come in different sizes. They are PCIe X1, X4, X8 and X16, and that is how many times faster it is than just the X1. So when we compare the X1 versus the X16 will have 16 times more bandwidth going across this slot than the X1 slot. As you can see, the X16 is much longer, whereas the X1 is just a small slot. If you have an X1 card but only X16 slots, then the X1 cards will fit into the X16 slots, but it won't work the other way around because the X1 slot is a lot smaller and the X16 cards won't fit. Let us now look at the AGP slots, where AGP stands for Accelerated Graphics Port. On the motherboard, we can see that we have an AGP universal slot. There are no blockers, so that means this AGP can fit other voltage too. They can just fit right in there, and this provides a space for additional intensive graphics ports. The AGP slots are a more intense than the standard PCI slots because the AGP ports can actually borrow system memory. It can borrow a little bit memory and, for example, use that in order to render 3D graphics for intense games that need 3D graphics, or designers who need to have video cards which are intensive for them to get a great color spectrum and a good 3D designing abilities. So that's what AGP cards allow them to do. So we see we have an AGP universal slot, a more restrictive AGP 1.5 volt slot here, which has a separator that restricts which card can be put in there to prevent us from putting the wrong type of card in. Then we have our AGP Pro slot. You notice that the AGP Pro slot is significantly larger than a standard AGP slot. This gives us the ability to put in our AGP Pro cards, which are bigger cards and sometimes more intensive cards. And you also see there's a small ticker here which prevents us from putting cards incorrectly into the slot. A smaller card will still fit into the slot, but the sticker keeps us from offsetting it incorrectly and misaligning the pins. However, we do have an AGP Pro card. We can remove this sticker so that we can place the card in. But if we aren't using the AGP Pro slot, then we should replace the sticker and put a little bit of tape over that to prevent us from misaligning pins. Next is the CNR slot, which is known as Communications Network Riser slot. CNR slots used to be a different slot known as an AMR, which was an audio modem riser. Now we use it just as CNR slot, and the CNR allows up to 6 channels of audio support. So sort of like the AGP was our accelerated graphics port, our CNR port or communications network riser allows us to have better audio channel support. So we have 2 more ports to add onto our list here are our AGP and our CNR. You'll definitely want to review all of these different port types and know what the differences in them are. Our last slot that we are going to look at on our motherboard is for input or output. These are actually memory slots. These will provide us with additional spaces for sound or accelerated graphics. These slots are where we place our RAM cards, which we have an example of here. Our RAM cards go into these slots and are locked into place by our levers here. These memory slots may have different quantities of memory on them depending on the motherboard, can have varying capacities. So we've gone over on slots on our motherboard. We have all of our input-output slots, PCI, PCIX, PCIe, AGP and CNR. And then we have our memory slots, which are not input-output slots, but they are additional slots on the computer, or rather our motherboard that we plug memory cards into.